This is a very quick lecture on the Enlightenment. This is a period that comes after the Restoration. And the kind of bawdiness and decadence of the Restoration really can't be maintained, especially after we have a change in monarchs, like the Glorious Revolution, and we have William and Anne come onto the throne. So this is basically the 1700s. And there are a couple different names for this. It can be called the Enlightenment, it can be called the Augustan Age, and it might be referred to as Neoclassicism. Some major historical events. We get a new family gets put on the throne, the Hanoverians, and this is George the First. He comes in 1714, and this is going to be a big deal. 1746, the Battle of Culloden in Scotland establishes Scotland had tried to break away from the British Empire and fight for its sovereignty. This is a massacre, and they are decisively defeated, and this leads to a lot of kind of punitive measures against Scotland and things like banning tartan, banning the tartan fabric that different clans wore to identify themselves, banning the Scottish language. They banned bagpipes for a little. They really try and eradicate Scottish culture and kind of forcibly anglicize them. In 1751, we get the Calendar Act. Until this time, Great Britain switched to a new year in March. Everybody else did it, of course, differently, what is called the Gregorian calendar, but there's this emphasis to bring Britain in line with what everyone else is doing. 1755, Johnson's Dictionary. We have one of the first dictionaries. It's created by one person, trying to regularize language. Notice 1768, we get the encyclopedia. So what we think of as kind of standard reference works, this repository of knowledge, that was developing in the Enlightenment. We also have the 7 Years' War, which is really important for American history, right? George Washington fights in this. I didn't put the year because you all should know it, the American Revolution. And then it kind of ends this period with the French Revolution. And then there's so many important philosophical and scientific things that happen. Isaac Newton, the theory of gravity, the invention of the discovery of calculus, just so many, John Locke and all of his thoughts about human development and government, which are really central to this century. So a lot of stuff is happening. These are really important. Enlightenment values differ from our own in some pretty important ways. Reason really matters to Enlightenment writers. A lot of Enlightenment writers. They like rules, they like harmony. They think that you should learn something from art, right? It should be moral, it should be didactic. It should teach you something. They value imitation over originality, right? Instead of doing something new, you should be imitating something old. They like restraint, they like refinement. Religious belief is pretty important to most of them. Belief in human goodness, right? There's a lot of technological progress, a lot of scientific progress. They think that people are getting better. Emphasis on individuals as controllers of their fate, and engagement in the public sphere. This century, all of these thoughts, philosophies are being printed and distributed, and we'll have newspapers and periodicals, and things like that. And people will be debating these ideas in the public sphere. Belief in the power of science, and a move away. That Restoration literature was really influenced by the court to one that addresses a more middle class audience. Okay, thinking about that imitation versus originality, there's this kind of debate that happens in the 18th century called the Battle of the Books. In France, this is called the Quarrel of Ancients and Moderns. And basically, it's kind of debating which are better, classical writers of like Greece and Rome or modern writers. And okay, we're seeing science go through like linear progress. Does literature do that too? Does like every aspect of human development do that? And so you have people kind of taking both sides, saying like, no, the ancients were the best and we should imitate them, or people are saying like, no, we're coming up with new ideas. But like our culture really values the new, and that was much more under debate in the 18th century. You just to kind of show the emphasis on didacticism. This is Richard from the beginning of Richardson's novel Pamela, which some of you have for novel tasting, where he says the purpose of this book, it's just to be entertaining, but at the same time, it's supposed to improve your mind. Like we're gonna and improve your mind with morality. Um, Now, the people who read like Richardson might be protesting a little much about how moral his novel is, but notice that he feels like he has to defend his novel in this way. Historical events that inform this movement, and this is going to be important to a lot of the poetry that we read in the, not this week, well, a little bit this week and at the end of this week and a little bit next week. The Enclosure Acts. So, during the 18th century, enclosures are regulated by Parliament, and each village that wanted to enclose its land needed to get an act of enclosure through. And this little diagram kind of helps you understand what this looked like in the like medieval and Renaissance system. This is called the open field system. And like if you look at like the little black strips, that could be land that's all owned by one farmer. And notice it's all over the place. It's not consolidated because maybe you buy a little strip of land, in 10 years, and maybe then, 50 years later, another strip of land comes up and your family buys it, but of course they're nowhere near each other. So after enclosure, like notice like the gray area, right? It's all enclosed. But you might notice that what gets removed in the enclosure is this area called the common. And we'll talk about the loss of the commons. So the positive effects, there's less land wasted. It was easier to use like machinery because your land was all together. You could experiment with crop rotation. Animal disease was less likely, and you needed just less labor. It was just more efficient. Negative effects. Okay, if you couldn't prove legal entitlement to the land your family may have worked for hundreds of years, you got evicted. Maybe you didn't own land, but you were like, maybe you had like a flock of geese that you let forage on that village common. That common area is what it says. Like everybody could use that. If you had like one dairy cow, you could let it out to graze there. You could let your geese forage there. So you once you lost the commons, you lost that ability to maybe have that extra income. Poor farmers, right, are unable to compete with large landowners as that land gets consolidated. This should sound very familiar to any of you who are in ag today, right? That little family farm that's maybe like 200 to 300 acres, right? What's going to happen to that? Like, you're going to get eaten up by the large landowners. And okay, where are all these people going to go? Poor evicted peasants go to the cities. And now they have to work in factories and in much poorer conditions. And there's just a lot of poverty. And so there's this like folk song from the 18th century. The law locks up the man or woman who steals the goose off the common, but leaves the greater villain loose who steals the common from the goose. Right. Land that lots of people had been used to using was suddenly taken away from them. But one result of this, changes in crop rotation, the plow, sheep, enclosures, increases agricultural productivity 300%. So we have a lot more food available, and this leads to an increase in the population because a lot of people starved to death in olden times. The population is increasing, and we have fewer agricultural workers. Remember, I said they went to work in factories. So, and we have science progressing and all of these technological improvements. All of these important inventions create the textile industry in Britain. And then we have the steam engine. Um, so we now have factories that those poor people can go work in. Now, there are some reactions against the Enlightenment. Starting in the middle of the 18th century, we get something that's called the cult of sensibility. And sensibility sounds like something, well, that would be sensible, but it actually means the reverse. It means like super emotionally sensitive and an emphasis on susceptibility to emotions, feelings, and sentiments. So it's really kind of definitely focusing more on feelings than on reason. And we get Gothic literature, which is designed to scare you, and it's about the supernatural, and so definitely not about reason. And we get a kind of reaction against the Enlightenment. Now, this is not the dominant culture. The dominant kind of ethos of the culture is still reason and rules and focusing on rational thought, but there is this reaction. And the 18th century ends with a real bang, right? The American Revolution kind of kicks off this revolution. Then we get the French Revolution. We'll have the Reign of Terror. And at the very end, we'll have the rise of Napoleon, who will be a dictator that threatens the peace of Europe for essentially the next 15 years and plunges Europe into extreme war. So we started out with all of this innovation and progress and thinking, and we're going to end the 18th century with a lot of blood and violence and feelings. And there are different English reactions to the French Revolution. There are people who think it's positive, and there are also people who think it's really negative. But these are all things to think about as we are reading our periodicals for Monday, our novels for next week, and then as we go into some of the poetry that we have to read. Thanks.